This is Midlife Reclaimed, a podcast that dares to ask the question, is there a better way to live this chapter of our lives? A few years ago now, early in my midlife chapter, I experienced a life-changing burnout. A burnout that made me question my career as a psychologist, my relationships, but also the culture in which I live in, which celebrated or seemed to celebrate this busy hustle culture. So this catapulted me into a midlife course correction and something that I continue to be on a journey on in terms of reclaiming and creating my midlife. And I'd love you to join in with me. Here, we'll question the life-draining systems that exist in our society, and we will open up to our vulnerability with open hearts to find real, lasting change. I will open up and share some of my vulnerability, as well as guests who choose to do the same, but also share practical wisdom from my profession, but also from other professions to help guide you with the wisdom needed to explore this chapter of your life and create it the way that you need to. I believe midlife is an opportunity to look in, to discover what is truly satisfying, fulfilling for you, and making those changes along the way. So if you're ready to call out what's broken, connect to your vulnerability like it's a superpower, and reclaim what is truly authentic for you, then you're in the right place. This is Midlife Reclaimed. Let's challenge the status quo, shape a better future for this chapter in our lives, one brave, courageous step at a time. Engaging in this podcast does not intend to create, nor does it create, a therapist and client relationship between you and myself. All the wisdom shared by myself or the guests is general in nature and not intended for your personal circumstances. As I have done for myself, I encourage those who are in distress to seek professional support. If you are in a life-threatening situation, please call your national emergency services. And if you're in need of urgent counselling, please contact any available national telephone services in your nation or see your doctor as soon as possible. Stay safe. And please remember that you do not need to do this alone. I'm joined by Karina Schneider, a certified coach, global people and cultural leader, and a passionate advocate for mentally healthy workplaces. Karina has spent over 2 decades working across sectors like consulting, healthcare, and nonprofits, and now focuses her energy on supporting professionals as they return to work after mental health leave, burnout, or parental leave. In our chat, we explore what it truly means to reintegrate into work in a way that's paced, sustainable, and aligned, especially for high-performing women in midlife. Karina brings a rare combination of lived experience and deep HR and coaching insight, and this conversation is both validating and empowering. So whether you're personally navigating a return, supporting someone else through one, or reimagining how work fits into your next chapter, this one's for you. Hey, Karina, welcome to Midlife Reclaimed. It's absolutely a pleasure to finally be here recording this discussion together. So welcome.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm really excited for our conversation. I know this was something we felt very, enthusiastic about. So, thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm so grateful that you reached out and we connected. And the work that you're doing is amazing and so needed, as we've had many discussions around, and hence why we're here and we're having this chat. So the listeners, the viewers, can benefit greatly from your wisdom. Because yeah. So let's start. I always, and this tends to be often an initial question for my guests, which is, what drew you to this work, the work of, returning, the whole return to work and the reintegration, especially after a breakaway for burnout, mental health? Yeah. What drew you?
Yeah. This is almost by accident that I landed into this. I remember maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, I was working in HR, and this was well before burnout became like a common terminology in the workplace. So I wasn't very much aware about burnout, but I was starting to see employees, particularly in a specific area, take
Mm,
time off. They suddenly just weren't at work anymore. And
mm,
then there's always these whispers around as to what happened to them, and burnout would often come up. And then they'd come back after several months, and yeah, they're doing some side project or they're kind of finding their way back in. They don't really have a job to settle into. And I always found that a little bit curious. I never had any personal responsibility for these employees. So it was really just something I was observing and
yeah.
just found it really interesting what their experiences were like. But it was never really talked about. And then
Mm,
fast forward several years later, going through my own experience of having had to take time off from work and navigating that return, and also finding myself feeling kind of confused and lost and not really sure, what all this meant for me. And as I started to talk to other people, now I had language for it, right? Like I could talk about burnout, I can talk about mental health absence. And I was starting to have conversations with others going through similar things. And then I started to recognize a certain pattern of
mm,
experiences. Of course, everyone's experiences are different, but there was several things that kept coming up in
mm,
terms of the going back that we were frustrated about the administration and the bureaucracy and feeling like, how do I relate to this and how do I relate back to my work environment?
mm,
Um, and all of that was happening as I was starting to think about coaching as something I wanted to spend more time on, and finding the area that I wanted to support. And I very much recall a conversation with my coach where she was
mm,
asking me questions about what meant a lot to me, like how do I channel this energy that I was having to do more work with mental health. And I recognized a lot of intense emotion as I spoke about returning to work after extended absences in general, whether that were parental leave or mental health leave.
mm,
And she pointed it out to me that there was a lot of emotion there,
mm,
and how can I channel that emotion in a way that was helpful and constructive
mm,
rather than feeling like this is all wrong and this is not okay and this is unfair and so on and so forth. And that's how
mm,
I landed focusing on this. I
mm,
realized that between my HR experience, my mental
mm,
health first aid experience, that I could probably carve a focus that could add value to this gap I was noticing
mm,
in
mm,
mental health care. I do have to say that it took me a while to feel comfortable with it, because at
mm,
that time, I really felt like mental health care was reserved for psychologists and psychiatrists and counselors and doctors. And I'm like, what am I doing as an
mm,
HR professional and as a coach dabbling in this space, right?
yeah.
So I needed to go through my process and
Mm,
my own conviction to say, how can I support this area with ethics and with integrity? And
mm,
realizing like, yeah, there was this little bridge in between that people were struggling with, and realized, hey, I could add some value here. So that was kind of the process of getting into
yeah.
return to work.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you did. And I'm so glad you worked through your own processes there, which I mean, I can relate in some ways, just like the word imposter comes up, like,
Yeah.
when we're veering into places that we feel a calling to, feel at the same time that unsure or uncertainty around whether there is a place or belonging here. But I'm so glad you did, because yeah, with our chats already, it is a missing link. Like, as a psychologist working in this space, having a coach like you focus on that return to work is something that would be so supportive and integrative of all those processes for the workplace, for the obviously the employee, the person, the human who's
Right.
returning, and any of their health professionals, including psychs they're working for. I think, yeah, it's just because they're already juggling the things they're juggling, and then you can juggle that space because it needs the attention. And I want to get
Yeah.
into that because you mentioned there in your own journey into this space, you had, before you needed to have an extended break for your health and well-being, you were curious, you started to notice patterns, and I was wondering if you can share that, like what are those yeah, patterns that you notice employees. I feel drawn to that area. Do you mind?
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course. Yeah. I mean,
Mm.
again, I have to caveat this with I was observing this from a distance, so I didn't necessarily know the
Of
circumstances of the
course.
individuals in
Yeah.
general, but they were close enough that I noticed these were high achievers. These were individuals who were so committed to the work. Um, the work was incredibly challenging. It was high pressure. There was a lot, it was high stakes. And I was starting to hear comments about people feeling really tired, feeling really frustrated, not
Mm,
feeling resourced enough as a unit
mm,
to be able to deliver on what was being expected of them. And it was high visibility work as well. So many eyes were on them. And then I was starting to notice at one point people were starting to feel unwell and start to
mm,
just leave. And maybe you know it as well from your work. As soon as somebody is off, particularly for mental health reasons, nobody says a word. Nobody says, they had an accident, an unfortunate accident, or they're at the hospital, they're recovering. You hear that for physical issues. But when it's mental health, it's just quiet. They don't
yeah.
say anything. And then you start to wonder, like, nobody knows what's going on or what happened to individual X or individual Y. Even the coming back was very low key. And then they're having conversations with stakeholders because they're trying to find a job for themselves or they're
Mm,
engaging in side projects. And I just found that really interesting because
mm,
again, these were, they are highly ambitious, very professional, very successful
mm,
individuals that any person would want to have back on the
mm,
team. But because they've been away, their jobs have been restructured or they've been covered by other individuals, so the job doesn't exist anymore, leaving them somehow floating in the
mm,
environment. And I was starting to notice that, and I thought, I wonder what might be going on here. And again, this was well
yeah.
before mental
Yeah.
health was part of HR conversations, much more
Okay.
so organizational conversations, right? So I
Yeah.
also felt uncomfortable thinking, what role do I have to play here if this were to
Mm,
happen to individuals within my scope of
mm,
responsibility? I had no idea. I mean, I would do 100
mm,
things differently today, if this, if this were to happen today, and these were things I
yeah.
observed today in my role, I definitely would have approached it differently or
Yeah.
would have spoken up more potentially.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. And just the difference, because this was back in the day where, yeah, mental health wasn't spoken about. It wasn't part of, like, I'm not sure with, I know you work internationally, don't you? Is that right? Yeah.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
in Australia, and I think we might be on the forefront of this, but I might be wrong, but the psychosocial safety
Yeah.
aspects and really bringing in understanding beyond just the beyond the mental health, but more
Right.
like how do we need to structure the culture at the workplace, how we communicate
Right.
to be psychosocially safe. And that's only
Yeah.
been more recent and very much, really catching up. But it really has only been in the recent years where mental health has been a focus in the workplaces. Right. And so, yeah, as a worker back then, like just not having the language, as you said, like around burnout. And I must admit, I mean, I'm a psychologist and I didn't have the language back in,
Yeah.
what was it, 2021, 2020,
Right.
sorry, when it started to happen to me. I mean, it's happened before. Now that I have language, I'm like, oh, that's what that was.
Right.
Before it turned into depression. And anyway, which is,
Yeah.
I was able to name that because I had language around mental health by then. But, we didn't, when you don't have language or you don't have understanding or it hasn't been brought out, how does one identify? It becomes silent, like you said. No one really talked about it. But if you don't have language, if you don't have, you know, people talking about it, how does one
Right.
who is struggling be able to communicate that or someone even see it? Anyway, I was just
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like we'll come back to those patterns in a way, like with, well, actually, maybe now, like, because you're in doing the work with return to work, moving into the coaching and helping people and helping organizations, like so closely working in that space and in the mental health space. I suppose, are you seeing some of the same things? Because you mentioned high achievers, very capable, hardworking in high pressured environments, high expectations, it sounds like, in terms
Yeah.
of what's expected of them, maybe of themselves or the companies. But yeah, I was
Yeah.
just wondering if there's other things that you've picked up that maybe not just the patterns of the individual, but the patterns of maybe the workplaces or,
Yeah.
culture. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always remind myself, and I don't know if this is something you would share, I'm curious to know as well, that when burnout happens, it's often as a result of the interaction between the individual and the environment. So I can't go out there and say, okay, if an environment checks the boxes on all of these things, then automatically people will burn out because there are people who manage and they, are able to cope with their environment without the impact of burnout. So I always find it fascinating that it's always in a way as a result of my risk factors or my personality, my temperament, my ambition, or my value system and how that interacts with the workplace. But yes, typically in a work environment, or even if it's not corporate work or employed work, where I've worked with individuals who've done vocational work, who are in academics or who are studying, there's often this high pressure baseline.
Mm,
Sometimes, unfortunately, it's also as a result of experiences at work that are really unpleasant and difficult. So there's what we sometimes phrase as toxic environment, but this one, I mean,
like,
it's really toxic, right? People get
mm,
discriminated, they go through harassment, they feel like they're being treated unfairly, that could
mm,
start to hamper that. And what
yes.
often I've observed with my work that brings people to that point of burnout is they're having a hard time creating meaning out of that situation and what they can do about it and what that says about them. So
Mm,
going back to high achievers, people who have high standards for themselves, high work ethics, there's
mm,
this need to power through and to push through
mm,
and to feel like I just have to deal with it
mm,
to the
mm,
point that they can't. And you and I know burnout doesn't happen from one day to the next. It's an accumulation sometimes of years and years of patterns and exposure
mm,
that in the end leads to that, right? And so you
mm,
just find yourself thinking, how did I get here? And then
mm,
you take a step back and you go through your recovery process and then you can look 5 years, 10 years back
mm,
and say, now I understand how I got here.
mm,
So definitely I see patterns around the work environment, so whether it's relationships, whether it's exposure to unfair or unpleasant
mm.
experiences, high stress, high workload, lack of autonomy, the personal sense of autonomy.
Yeah.
But what
Mm,
I think isn't
mm,
spoken about as much, but I've also observed is when individuals start to recognize there is a lack of alignment between
mm,
what they consider to be important and how that's expressed at work, right? So there's a
mm,
mismatch. They're starting to find a mismatch between their value system and
mm.
what they're experiencing in the workplace. And that in the end causes a lot of the stress that's then tends
Yeah.
to snowball to burnout. But I don't believe that we talk about that part
I,
enough.
I agree, and I'm so glad that you brought that up. I mean, yeah, I see all of that too, and just hearing your experience as well with the people you see, and it's just really, yeah, what are those patterns out there? What are you noticing? And I love how you articulated because it is the interaction. Like I often talk about like there's always individual and organizational factors, that,
Right,
and the research indicates that too. But on the ground, clinically working with people, that's what we see too.
right,
Um, but I love that you say it's a relational thing because I think in my language, I think, or maybe just not even my language, it's also how I process it. I think because it is relational, I think I might separate them too
right.
much, but it's a
Mm,
relational interaction. Anyway, I think that's just going to sit with that. I like that. But yeah, I often say value mismatch or meaning mismatch.
right.
You use that word. I think another one that often doesn't get talked about too is, and this might actually, when you were talking about the meaning value mismatch, it made me think about like a lot of clients some clients that I work with are understimulated, but it can
Yeah,
be from that meaning mismatch too. Uh, yeah, when we look into that stimulation, like what stimulates and what doesn't. And yeah, it's not as simple as I'm bored, but that often doesn't get talked about because that can stress us
Right.
out. Like if we're not, yeah, if we're not stimulated enough, because we talk about
Right.
the burnout that we're overstimulated.
Right.
But I think
Yes.
the value mismatch really highlights to the underwhelmed or the under
Yeah.
stimulated, which stress does stress our body out, body, mind, and spirit, because we want to be, some of us, do want to
Yeah.
feel connected um,
Absolutely.
relationally to ourselves, to our environment, our work environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that also happens with life phases, and I can, I know we're gonna get into that too, but I know individuals, including myself, where after becoming a parent,
Mm,
our sense of, meaning or our value system will change, and we're not necessarily consciously thinking about it from that lens, right? But we go back, we've changed, we've evolved. I'm now a mom, and now how I relate to work should also
mm,
evolve to consider that other aspect
mm,
of my identity. And I know
mm,
in my situation, I didn't think about that. I led a very compartmentalized life. Like work was one thing and
mm,
personal was something else. So even after becoming a mom, I went back to work with exactly the same wiring and the
mm,
same approach and the same um, attitude and drive um, as before becoming a parent, which isn't wrong. I don't want to say that I shouldn't have that. I
mm.
just couldn't recalibrate how much slice of the pie it took. And of
Yeah.
course, the size it needed to change to accommodate that I'm also now a parent. And I
Mm,
didn't know how to think about it that way without feeling like, oh, but people might think I'm not ambitious anymore, or people might think I'm not that reliable, high
mm.
performer anymore. So I was afraid to reduce the size
Yeah.
of the pie that it took, but I needed to. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it's not
you
gonna
burn you'll
work,
burn
right?
you'll burn out or
Exactly.
other things, in terms of your
Right.
health and well-being. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that whole return to work, even if we've taken that, not even when we've taken that step back to, yeah, birth of our child and having that leave and then moving back because you've shifted, you've evolved, you've changed, your personal life has yeah, evolved. But that often, I think what you're saying there in your own personal experience, you return to work with that same mode, functioning, mindset, expectation
Right.
that hasn't evolved and shifted with how your life
Yeah.
has. And it makes me think
Exactly.
like, and yeah, I mean, my work in the midlife era, certainly there are some people having children, they have young children and can be
Right.
struggling with some they're evolving and changing in other ways, whether it's their kids leaving the home or they've got
Right.
teenage kids. I always say that with I probably just hear all the horror stories. But with the line of work that I do, well, I shouldn't say horror stories. I should say just the
Right.
challenges
The
and
challenges,
the
right.
challenges. I should say that they're not horror stories. They're just challenges.
Yeah.
Um, but even when as midlife women, our bodies change and evolve. We go
Right.
through perimenopause, menopause, and then postmenopausal, and so our bodies are changing and shifting.
Right.
So yeah, but this return to workspace, and we'll come to yeah, like wherever we're at as a woman, or of course, any men listening as well, like any person listening, where they're at, our identities, our relationship with work can shift and change as
Right.
our personal lives or our spirits or whatever are evolving and changing.
Yeah.
Yeah, honing in on that return to workspace, I just got drawn to a question because you've taken leave both as becoming a mother, but also for your health and well-being, for mental health.
Right.
It was your burnout, wasn't it? Is that, yeah.
Right.
Just wanted to get that correct,
Yes.
as have I and many, many
Yes.
people. But in
Mhm.
your experience, I just wanted to hone in on because I know a lot of women, people. I just tend to work with a lot of women. Find it really hard to step away to even make that decision. And I know
Yeah.
you help in the area of return to work, but I'm sure that is something that I just wonder what you can talk to around that struggle that some people have with even taking that time away, whether
Right.
it's some sick leave or unpaid leave, whatever it might be. Yeah.
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 I think it's really tough for people to come to that conclusion to take time off because again, like burnout creeps up on you, right? So
Oh, yeah.
for a long time, you will just think this is just stress, it's going to go away, it's going to get better. And so we have that narrative in our minds that, oh, this is just normal. Everyone's stressed these days, or like this is just a
Yeah.
highly stressful time, or and so
Mm,
we rationalize our experience as something that's hopefully temporary.
mm,
And what I've observed, it was often with a third party or somebody else like a trusted person to that individual who says, you don't come across like the way you used to be, or something is changing, or I'm noticing this. It often requires somebody else to point out, I'm concerned about you. Have you maybe considered talking to a doctor? Right. So it's
yeah,
hard for
it's
individuals, I think,
true.
who are in it to take a step back and say, this is no longer healthy for me to take that. And the decision to step aside or to temporarily take time off comes with a lot of questions, comes with a lot of doubts, a lot of fears. Am I gonna keep my job, or what does this mean, or how are my colleagues or my manager gonna treat me if I do that? So there's so many. I feel like there's so many questions we
Yeah.
ask ourselves before we
Yeah.
even decide, and the uncertainty of like, what am I gonna hear from my doctor if I do go,
Mm,
and feeling okay with, yeah, maybe I do need to take time off. I think there's so much that goes on internally around that. What
100%.
doesn't help is
Mm,
that many of us, I will speak for myself, we don't look at what benefits we have at work because we
mm,
never think we need them. So many individuals who do decide to take time off are unaware of their absence policies. They're unaware how long they're allowed to take time off or what financial support they get out of it. So there's so much we just don't know, and there's so much
mm,
uncertainty, and we know our brains don't like that. And so
mm.
we create a lot of rationalization before we realize, okay, maybe I do need to go
Investigate.
and
Mm.
consider taking that time off.
God, that's so true. And I think about the person where, they're burnt out. And like you said, it's something that's going on for ages, but it's almost like it feels like it comes out of the blue. But then, like you said, I think earlier, like retrospect, you're like, oh no. But at the time, I know for me at least,
Yeah,
even though retrospect, no, it was a build up, it felt like it
yeah,
all came to a head. And so I was just identifying that our mind is already in a not a great position to deal with
right,
or be able to consume or decide because our executive functioning as a result of
right,
stress, which burnout is not able, yeah, to compute as well as it usually can. So I
right.
can, yeah, that rationalization, which the brain does under that chronic stress and threat, can be very attractive, like, or just
Right.
easier to go with, not easy in the end, because when
Yeah.
we keep pushing, we eventually break. But I love what
Yeah.
you mentioned there, and it was totally my experience. And actually, I suppose I'm that for some of my clients as well, that voice outside that says, you're not like, well, in my case with clients, it might be, look, you're really struggling. I can really see how much is going on and everything that you're carrying, and really, exploring that together. It's always their decision. But I know for me, I was working with a lovely supervisor who we were trying to actually, she never labeled it burnout. She was my supervisor, not my psych, but like she knew I was struggling, and we are looking at diversifying my work, and rather than taking time off, we were reducing clients and all that kind of stuff as well. But it was my director that I had a meeting set up for to reduce even more and possibly
Mm.
stop and take a break. Um, who just said to me, "You're not okay. You
Yeah.
like, it's up to you what you do." But she actually said, "I think you actually you need to step away totally, not to do a reduce down. You need to step away now, and I'll support you." And
Yeah.
that was being the person in, and I was totally burnt out by that stage. I was at breaking point. I was broken. I know I'm okay with that term. I don't mean
Yeah.
that derogatory or judgment wise. I just was completely shot. My nervous system was down. Um, and yeah, just to have that kind,
Yeah.
compassionate woman who was in a position of power because she was the director to
Mm.
support me in that. And I was lucky I worked in a psych practice. The director was a psychologist, so her mental health knowledge was just phenomenal. So she was able to guide, uh, well, just a guide at least in the workplace and deal with
Yeah.
all that and help me deal with all that. I think it does take, and I think this is where it's so important that the workplaces, they don't have to be psychologists or coaches or mental health professionals, but have some knowledge or wisdom to and knowledge of what the policies are or procedures so they can guide that employee to
Right.
what they need. Yeah, time off.
I'm so glad. Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because often it really is the individual's decision. Like at least in my practice, I rarely come across cases
Yeah.
where it was the manager who said, "Hey, maybe this is helpful for you to take some time off." It really came from the
Mm,
individual to make that choice, which is good for them. However, I
mm,
sometimes wonder if we're able to have the conversations with our workplaces early enough, maybe we can
mm.
avoid the absence altogether, right? Like before we reach breaking
100%.
point,
Yes.
where to your example, like can we talk about how we can adjust the work? How can we talk about um yeah, a different kind of exposure while you're still able to work
Yeah.
to reduce the level of stress, to reduce exposure to things that are just difficult for the employee. So we avoid absence altogether, right? But I think that doesn't yet happen
Mm,
enough because managers also don't necessarily feel, and they admit it, they don't feel equipped to have those conversations. They
yeah.
don't know when it's time to step in, or they think like,
Mm,
hey, this is really personal and private, so I should just step away. And that's one of
yeah.
the things I hope will change over time, that we catch it early enough, we can have the conversations early enough, and we
Mm.
can avoid the extended absence altogether.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up, like those preventative measures, because I always have the word flexibility in my head. It's something that in the psych approaches I use with clients, it's psychological flexibility, but talking more about
Yeah.
environmental flexibility,
Right.
uh, once they have that knowledge and wisdom around what they can do, because yeah, we can prevent that absence by shifting the load temporarily or permanently. Like I know now where my in terms of how many clients I see per day. But my load was definitely not sustainable.
Yeah.
It was the industry average, but
Mhm.
not sustainable. But that ability to work with your employer, or I wasn't employed by these people, but it was still I still answered to them. I was
Right.
working under their group practice, but is having that flexibility of the environment, and for that individual, what they might need to work from home. I know for my nervous system, it works better at home.
Mhm.
My nervous system in an
Right.
open plan office, no.
Oh,
So where possible, that flexibility in the workplace can really make a difference to prevention, but also in that return to work phase as well, right? Because it's not
right.
that I often talk about, it's not black and white. It's not like we go away, everything's great, and we come back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi there. I'm so glad that you stumbled across this video for wherever you came from, for whatever reason that you've landed on here. Most likely you're a midlife woman feeling overwhelmed, stressed, burnt out, maybe. I'm glad you're here. In this video, I want to give you an introduction to what the Midlife Reclaimed community is all about. So I'm Shannon Swales. I am the creator of this community and also the guide inside the community as well. So, in order to tell you the story of this community, I need to go back to 2021, which is where I suffered a really big burnout that led me not to be able to work, to move away from my career, what I thought was going to be permanent, but wasn't, as a psychologist working in private practice at the time, one on one with people. In my own burnout recovery, I recognized and realized, and even in my experience as a psychologist, the value and importance of connection, that we don't heal alone. I've tried it. It did work a little bit, but long term, it doesn't. Connection and community is certainly key. So in my own recovery, certainly making steps to do that myself, which has had its challenges, but that's another story. But in terms of when I decided to move back into the career of psychology to niche and support people going through burnout, I realized the need to have group type or community connection type programs or support groups, and actually started there when I first came back in 2023, did some online groups and some workshopy type things. But that's where, like, I really have at my core that community connection needs. So as my practice evolved and I became more focused on midlife women, because it just happened to be that I was working one-on-one with a lot of midlife women, I realized that the community connection type resources that I was going to do needed to also move into that area. So that's how Midlife Reclaimed community came to be. And it's had a little rough start, as most do. It started out as more of a program based, offering offering education and skill based programs inside the online community, but it didn't really take up. And when I spoke to midlife women out there and really asked what they needed, it the consensus that came back was, I don't need something that requires me to do more. I need to do less and be more, be held, be seen, be heard. So I redesigned the Midlife Reclaimed community to really have at its heart a space that women can arrive to with each other. So live online spaces where me, as your guide and experienced mental health professional, can certainly create that safe environment for you to be held, to be supported, to be able to reflect, to be able to come back to yourself. So that's at the heart of the community, but there is so much more involved in it as well to support you. But that's in another video, so I'll let you have a look at that. But that's Midlife Reclaimed community. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. There's contact details available in the captions, but please reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions to see if this community is suitable for you. But there's also a 7-day free trial, so come along, check it out, come to a heart space, the live support group, to see if it's a good fit. It's no cost, so you can always choose to opt out as well. Anyway, that's enough from me. I look forward to welcoming you inside the community. Take gentle care of you. Bye for now. Yeah, maybe I just feel a little bit pulled towards, because we've talked about, those challenges with taking time off and, the
Yeah.
measure of prevention,
Yes.
like if workplaces, moving forward. But that return to work challenge, for the individual, but also for the workplace, just because,
Yeah.
again, like you said, it's relational.
Yeah.
What do you notice in that space with returning to work? Yeah, after
Yeah.
burnout or any other mental health, because you see, like, it's not necessarily always burnout. Hey, the people.
No, and remember speaking about return to work after mental health leaves in a corporate session, and somebody in the audience raised their hands and said, "Why are you being so specific about burnout and mental health leave, and not specifically also just or not including coming back from parental leave?" And she so astutely pointed that a lot of what I was saying spoke so much to her as a person coming back from parental leave as well. So it was really, I was so grateful to get that comment.
Yeah,
It was not meant to be exclusive. It was more to say, like, there's a specific area we don't talk enough about around
yeah,
mental
mental
health.
health. Yeah,
While, there's a lot more ease around, it's not necessarily easier, but it's more easeful for organizations and employees to talk about coming back from parental leave, right? And so I'm so grateful, because I think a lot of what we can talk about, individuals who might be listening who are new parents, or have other life
yeah.
changes,
I,
it might relate to them too.
yeah. And so, Karina, I know you're going to answer this question, but I think, like, because that person who gave you the feedback was saying a lot of it related to her, and it made me think of what you said earlier too about your own personal shifts
Yeah. Yeah.
with coming back after parental leave. But that area of that time in a woman's life, or even a person's life, that's so altering and changing that, I mean, okay, when we talk about mental health, we often think we are talking about mental health conditions, but we're also just
Right.
talking about our emotional, mental, and spiritual
Yeah.
well-being. And
Right.
when we become parents, a lot of that shifts in good and also challenging ways. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that return to work in any of those shifts, like I even think for, if you're coming back from a health, pretty significant operation, I think my dad with triple bypass, he worked for himself, but
Mm.
still returning to work after
Yeah.
having that massive, massive life altering event. People who go through cancer treatment, like because that rocks you
Yeah.
psychologically, socially, spiritually. So,
Yeah.
and this can impact we don't have to have a mental health condition. It can just
No.
wreck our mental health. I mean, it can. I mean, even
Yeah.
postnatal depression, postnatal anxiety. These things
Yeah.
can bring about mental health
Yeah.
conditions. But I just think, yeah, a lot of it is relevant. Sorry, I just my long-winded and
No, but I think you're raising an important point, which I would encourage the listeners to reflect on, which is, and I know this from my own experience, when I came back after my parental leave, it was celebrated. There were flowers, people were excited, like, oh, what is it like? Like everybody's willing to come back and embrace you and celebrate this your growing family, and your job is in most cases protected. I can't say that that's the case for all. But when
mm,
somebody comes back out of illness or disability
yeah,
or mental health absence or burnout, it's quiet. People don't know what to do. They don't know how to receive the individual back, all
mm,
with good intentions. They're just a bit more
I just don't
cautious
know.
and careful. And
Mm,
so for the returning individual, you can already see the gap in the quality of experience they have
yeah,
between the two, just to point it out for people to think, how is your workplace treating different forms of absences, to
yeah,
consider, or even different forms of work flexibility when we talk about individuals going through menopausal symptoms, for
yeah,
example.
yeah.
Are there are the organizations explicit about the practices around that?
Mm.
Often they're not.
Oh. No, it's
But
only
you
just
do
becoming a
have a
conversation.
policy for parental leave and benefits
Mm.
for parental leave. It's in black and white. And then
Yeah.
for many other scenarios, there's nothing written. And so for people coming
Mm,
back, it makes it even more difficult because they don't know what they're working with.
mm,
They don't know what to expect. They don't
mm.
know what to ask for. And transitioning into returning to work specifically, that's part of the questioning they have, as they not only are they asking themselves, are they ready? Like,
Yes.
how do I know I'm ready to go back?
I get
But
that one a lot.
also,
Yeah. How am I?
yeah, how do I
Yeah. Like,
know, right?
how do
There's
I
no
know?
checklist.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like,
Do that,
oh, okay. And
right?
I'm very transparent with that. Like, it's such and let's nut that out. Let's explore. But it's
Yeah,
a common pattern. Like, am I ready? But
right,
there's also these questions around, the workplace and yeah.
right.
Sorry, you were saying.
Yeah.
Mm,
No, just to highlight that, like you question yourself if you're ready. You question yourself if this is the right thing to go back to. You
yeah.
question yourself about what will it be like on the first day that I'm back and the
Mm,
types of conversations I will have. Do I talk about my burnout? Do I not talk about my burnout? I mean, there's so many questions that's loaded with a lot of emotion,
yeah.
that makes the decision making and the transition difficult for people, just because
Yeah.
you don't also see a lot of examples that
Mm,
you can copy from or take patterns and advice from, right? And so it
mm.
almost, for many individuals I've worked with, it almost feels like a really risky guessing game they're having to work through.
Yes. And I was just thinking, like, coming back to your very observed and clinically witnessed, around that silence. No one knows how to deal with it. So there's silence. So that poor person or that person thinking about returning, and they're not, no one's reaching out sort of to meet them or go, hey, this is what's happening, or checking in or whatever it might be, to open that conversation so that it would be all the more risky and all the more uncertain for them in that silence. And it makes me think of why, it's a big reason why I speak about mine. I mean, it's just one experience.
Yeah.
And I'm always, well, not always, but I try and, this is just my experience, doesn't mean it's going to be yours, or this is what will work for you. But I talked to that return to work, and I had stages. Like because
Mm.
I ended up being 4 months off work. I didn't go back to what I was doing. And that's what I want to talk to you about. But I went back to something completely different, non-clinical.
Yeah.
I wasn't working as a psychologist, working as a teacher. And I
Yeah.
even went back part-time, and I ended up doing that for 18 months. And I did decide then to go back to clinical practice as a psych, but in a very different way. But it was like a
Yeah.
staged, it was a no one's, I was
Yeah.
going to say very imperfect, but everyone's is, but it's, yeah, it was just the road I ended up traveling, and it sort of just
Mm.
unfolded over time. Um,
Yeah.
but coming back, like that return to work, the challenges there, the questions,
Yeah.
I mean, what do you find? I feel like like just the workplace, because you said like it's met a lot with silence, because you work with the individual, but also with
Yeah.
helping. Yeah, tell us a little bit more about what you do and how you, I suppose, yeah. I mean, I know it would be different for each person, but
Yeah.
maybe some idea about how you, yeah, that's supporting that transition, because we've
Yeah.
talked about a lot of the challenges, and I'm sure more will come up.
Right.
Mm.
Absolutely. So my work is primarily towards the individual. So I'm not hired typically by the organization or the employer. My service is typically requested by the returning individual.
Lovely.
But for context, at least in my environment, we have what we call case managers. So these are individuals typically internal to the organization, but they could be external. So they're connected to insurance companies, for example, and
Yes.
in a way, they get assigned to the absent
Mhm.
employee. And part of
Yes.
their role is to actually facilitate that transition from absence to work.
Mm.
So the work that I do is not necessarily unique, I think, but I think the angle I take is different because for many um, case managers, at least the experience I've been told, so I want to just disclaim that. I can't say that as a general, but they're very much focused on the process of going back, the administration of coming back, the sorting through options as to what they can come back to. The
Mm.
angle I take is much more personal, and
Mm.
it's really supporting the individuals through embedding back to life what they've learned through their absence and the recovery.
Yeah.
And how do you create this bridge that cements and takes all those learnings into, well, what does this mean now practically for
Mm.
what I go back to, when I go back, how I go back? How do I
Mm.
have the conversations with the people I work with, whether it's employed or non-employed? Even if you're a stay-at-home parent, but you're still
Mm.
going back to unpaid work and you
Yeah.
still have stakeholders
Well,
in your
yeah.
unpaid work, right? So how do you take all of that into the practical steps? Not
Mm.
forgetting that this is also not just about the job. You're going back to life in the way that you know it as well.
Mm.
And I find that that's what is often missing in the
Mm.
return to work transitions. And that's where I kind of come in and try to bridge
Mm.
that gap to
Mm.
say, well, what's different this time? What have you learned through your recovery period to
Mm.
say, well, this is how I'm going to interact differently this time around.
Mm.
Here's how
Mm.
I'm going to relate differently to my work environment this time around. And then how
Mm.
do you create that accountability that it actually happens so we don't
Mm.
relapse? One of the things I find really important, and I think is not also maybe articulated enough, is that we don't go back when we're quote unquote 100% recovered. I don't
Mm.
even know, frankly speaking, if there is such a thing, because I think we continue with a recovery process more and more. It's just maybe more easeful this time around. But we go back not necessarily feeling like we're fully recovered. And I think we shouldn't be waiting for that either. And
Mm.
so the going back isn't like, oh, I'm well. Now I just get to go back and do what I used to do. No, I mean, there will be speed bumps along the way. We're having to recognize who we are today and how
Mm.
have we changed and how does our environment receive that. And
Mm.
some days will be easy and some days won't be easy. And some days we
Mm.
might think my recovery has taken 10 steps back.
Yeah.
Typically not, but that's the story we tell ourselves, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's important for returning individuals to be clear on what's the mindset they're holding about return to work.
Mm.
so that they can manage the capacity, the amount of time, their energy, their responsibilities in a way that meets what they need and what they're able to do in the moment.
Oh, so needed. All of that. Tick, tick, tick. Like I'm like, that's just yeah. It's like that difference between the case management, and we have that a lot with, yeah, the insurance companies, whether it's the public or private,
Yeah. Yeah.
often not well, separate to the workplace, but communicating with
Yeah.
the workplace in some way.
Right.
But yeah, they're very non-personal.
Mm.
Often you get one that might have a very compassionate, demeanor about them, but still the work requires them to be quite, yeah, like do this
Yeah.
because just very business like you
Right.
communicated. But with yours, it's really personal. It's really helping them bridge that, being off, going back, but all those things, what do I need? Like I really heard that too, because often in my work with burnt out women, one of the really big patterns is that they have been constantly in the pattern of giving out to others, which often our roles in life, whether
Yeah.
work or home, require, and lots of us at sometimes. But I mean, like a complete, like there is not like, and instead of any care in any kind of thoughts of what do I need, it's often criticism or judgment, or I'm, all that pushing through, just
Yeah.
completely abandoning ourselves, not meaning to, but just out of
Yeah.
learned. So just hearing that with that bridging, like that real focus on the person, what do they need? What are those things that their mind is telling them about their return to work, and really being able to shift or support their needs in that. I just, yeah, that is, oh, I mean, yeah, that would be amazing work. I mean, challenging work, but amazing and much needed. I mean, what do you notice with the people you work with in being supported in that way?
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you
Yeah.
notice with them?
I think that what I'm no, I mean, what I've observed is they gain so much from the recovery period, right? So at this point, when individuals come to me, they've had their time in whether maybe it's therapy or counseling or maybe other recovery methods that they found helpful for them.
Mm,
And so they come to a point where like, okay, now I understand my experience. Now I know what needs to be different. But it all in a way stays theoretical, or maybe they've applied it at home in their private environments, but
I
then they're
haven't.
now confronted with,
Mm.
oh, but now there's this job, right? Or there's
I've got
this
to go.
workplace.
Yes, I've
Um,
got to go back in that environment. I'm going to relate to this
exactly.
environment now with this new or evolved. Because I often,
Yeah.
like, you talked about burnout. Do we ever really recover? I often think about, like, we evolve, hopefully.
Yeah.
I think
Yes.
burnout is almost like a precipice or a teacher of, like, we need to change something. Something needs to change. Something's not working.
Yeah.
So I don't see it as that we recover, although I use burnout
Yeah.
recovery as a
Of
term.
course.
It's
Yeah.
more that we evolve, we change, we grow.
Yeah.
And hopefully that means we don't have the burnout symptoms ever again.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we're
Yeah.
going to get stressed because stress is normal. But anyway,
Of
sorry,
course,
I
yeah.
digress.
I mean, we will have the stress, but I love what you're saying is like when we talk about recovery, we have to be clear what we mean by recovery because it's not recovering necessarily from a mental health illness in the way
Mm,
we know about it today, but it's
mm,
what's the growth and what's the evolution, as you said, that we're
mm.
working towards. And so I think there are different perspectives we can take around what
Yeah.
recovery looks like and feels like, and how
Mm,
do we know that yeah we're done with the process, as opposed to, well, we've now learned the skills and we now know more about who we are, to be able to go back into that work environment and
mm,
stand up for this evolved version
mm,
that we already are.
mm.
um but there are these questions, right? And there's a risk inherent in that because you never know until you're actually back in the work environment to actually be able to play it out and see what happens, right? I often
100%.
encourage my clients to create a test environment before they're officially back.
Oh, that's a
So,
good idea.
if you've been, off for several months where you didn't really have a routine, well, start creating a routine or
Mm,
start volunteering or start giving yourself some sense of responsibility that you're accountable to start
mm,
noticing, well, what does this feel like? And
mm,
where's my capacity at? Or how am I approaching this quote unquote work?
Mm.
to be able to, yeah, in a way, simulate what it
Mm.
might feel like when you're officially back. I know it's not a perfect simulation,
Oh,
but it
but
gives people a bit of a
oh,
sense of being exposed to something again
mm.
and seeing how they respond to it.
It really aligns with very evidence-based approach
Mm,
to anxiety
right.
disorders, particularly where there's a feared object or a feared experience or something that, and I'm using it all the time, not to its full extent and on how
Yeah.
it's taught, but fitting it to the personalizing it. But it's that exposure therapy, that in order to see or to build, because otherwise it's theoretical, as you said,
Right.
to see how things play out, how maybe those boundary skills that you've gained or that you've been applying in your personal life, but now seeing how you apply them at workplace, that we need to actually expose ourselves to either something that simulates that in our personal
Yeah.
life, like getting into that responsibility routine and seeing how that capacity fits or feels. I think that
Yeah.
that's smart. It's evidence based. And I think that's why, or not think, that's why I advocate. And the research seems to have, well, the limited research in return to work
Hmm.
after burnout, but around gradual going part
Yeah.
time or
Yes.
reduce workload and where possible, especially if you're going back to the same workplace, if you're
Yeah.
going to a different workplace, it can still warrant that. It still warrants a gradual, where possible, a gradual
Yeah.
return just to experiment. I often use that word too, experiment and
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
how these new skills. And it makes me think of, I used the teaching job for that because I had the wisdom and knowledge from my psych
Yes.
training. I was also seeing a psychologist as well during my time off and my return to work. But I saw it as a training ground. I went, okay, it was a new workplace, so I didn't have any of the old triggers. It was a different line of work, which had its own challenges, but it
Yeah.
was also, yeah, an opportunity to try out this new evolved version of me who wasn't
Yes.
fully recovered. And I loved how you put that. I needed to go back to work, not just financially, but also it was part of my recovery. I felt I got to a point where I needed to be at work for my own well-being because work
Yeah.
can be a well-being inducer.
Yeah. And
It's
I think
not
that's a
all
bit the
bad.
thing, right? We need to remember that work is supposed to be good for us,
Yeah.
right? Work shouldn't be the enemy of our well-being and our mental health. And I'm not saying this because I'm naive about, how complex and complicated and difficult the work environment has been over the years, but work is inherently supposed to be good for us. And
Mm,
so how do we start to get to that place again where we welcome it and we're excited to go back,
mm,
knowing that we are in our recovery process and we're going to test things out, and as we experiment we're going to
mm.
discover new things.
Yeah.
And this is where, yeah, you said something earlier about, what do you go back to, and part of
Yeah.
that decision making is, do I go back to the same job, do I go back to the same employer but different job, do I pivot completely?
Mm,
I think there are
complete
many
career
different
changes.
considerations, yeah, complete
Mm,
rechange. And
mm,
there is a tendency for individuals to feel like, oh, I just cannot go back there. And there are cases where I absolutely would say do not go back, because as we spoke about the risk factors earlier, the environment could very well just not be a healthy place for the individual.
100%.
So the idea of going back is probably going to derail the recovery more than
Mm,
support it. But there
mm.
are difficult decisions around, your job
Oh,
security and your financial security, or how much time do you actually have to not work
yeah.
completely.
Mm,
What's gonna work best for your own recovery, and
yeah.
what does that scenario look like. And there are certain things we will know before going back and can help make those decisions, but there are things we just don't know. But I was
Yeah.
reading a book called Designing Your Life, which I absolutely love,
Oh,
many years ago, and they talked about this concept of discernment,
okay.
and part of decision making. And I realize many of us will go into the tendency of rationalizing our options, doing
Mm,
pros and cons, and just like using our heads a lot for the
mm,
decision of where to go back to. But the book was also talking about discernment in terms of what are all the other ways of knowing what is the right thing for you for now. And it's accessing your gut, accessing your body, accessing your emotions, which I never learned how to do growing
Mm.
up, right? So I was the one who would go through analysis and
Yeah.
overanalyze rather
Yeah.
the
Me
options
too.
in front of me, right? And but there's so much value in just sitting with all these different options
Mm.
to think about, well, what would it feel like if I went with option A versus option B? What would feel, even if it might not be the obvious rational choice, but it feels like the right choice.
I love that. Yeah, that is so important. Because I see that a lot too. It's a big pattern. And the things that you mentioned earlier, that patterns that you see in the people that often end up burnt out, high achievers, we often tend to be a lot more in the forebrain, whatever, the executive
Yeah,
function. We tend to be the thinkers, and that can bode us well in lots of areas.
for
But
sure.
sometimes it needs to take a like I sometimes say to my client, we just need to put it on the couch over here and bring up this
Right.
other and work on this skill. Because like you said, a lot of us haven't been coached or supported or nourished in this way of being,
Yeah.
often because the people raising us haven't been nourished or supported in that
Yeah.
way either. So
Yeah.
we're
Absolutely.
I feel like a lot of Gen Xers and millennials are learning all this,
Yeah.
gaining all this and then passing it on. But yeah, really tuning into the body and asking ourselves, how does that feel? Let's just entertain it. I love that. It's another
Yeah.
way to come to um, decisions other than what we think or rationally think is right. And I think for someone, that's why, being able to, if possible, create some space from the stress or offloading, like if we can, yeah, reduce our workload or step back from work, often gives us that space to be
Yeah.
able to, yeah, come back to ourselves in that way or learn how to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You're
because
pointing
it's
to
important.
something important, if I may add, which is this idea that, oh, I'm burnt out. I need to take some time off specifically to just rest. And that
Mhm.
means then I take this time to rest and now I can go back. And I think what I think is coming through our conversation is the time off is not just about resting, right? It's reconnecting with who we are, what we know about ourselves, all these new skills that we're learning around boundaries and values and stress, coping mechanisms and so on and so forth. And I think that's the other thing that I've seen lead to unsuccessful returns when the work has primarily just been to rest, but there's not as much reflection and conversation about who we really are as individuals and how do we design that life that serves
Yeah.
us
Mm.
more.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to jump that in because again,
Oh,
for
glad.
a lot of high achievers and high performers, there's a very real tendency to want to go back quickly and
Yes.
to go
Or not
back
leave at
like
all.
at yeah, or not leave at all,
Want everything to
or
stay
go
the same.
back
Fix me. That's what I like.
exactly.
Psychologists like, not that they say fix me, but it's like I've got to stay at work and do everything, and I need to get well. So they're just
Right,
psychology becomes or their therapy becomes another task to do rather than
right.
a place that
Yes,
they can come back to themselves. But yeah, they're still in the environment and yeah, anyway.
yeah,
But I
exactly.
mean, I always talk about walking alongside them and walking with them and seeing where that goes.
Yeah,
But it's so important. And the research backs that up. I think of I don't know if you've come across his work, but Nick Petrie. He's been spending he's originally from New Zealand, but he seems to be all over the place.
yeah,
International guy, but I think he's back in New Zealand now. But he's a researcher by trade, so to say, but his last 10 years has really been focused on the burnout area.
yeah,
And that was something and a very qualitative research. So going in and lots of interviews, lots of talking to people who are in burnout or past burnout, but returned
yeah,
or whatever. And exactly what we have been saying, what we see on the ground is what he's just, compiled into
yeah.
some data and really captured that it's got to be more than rest. It's not enough. Yeah, it's just not enough, not for burnout.
Yeah.
It needs to be this very, yeah, exactly what you said. We don't need to say. And it's hard work, it's challenging work, but it is meaningful work that I might, being on the other side, will change your life for the better. But,
For sure.
I
Yeah,
mean,
Yeah.
life has its challenges still, but it's not emotionally and mentally sucking the life out of me anymore.
No, and I mean everyone I've worked with have said, yeah, I wish, they recognize the growth they go through. We only wish it didn't have to go through burnout to get to that place, of course, right? Like, could it have been easier? Maybe,
Mm.
but maybe this is the way, life experience has to come to a point of, where we are forced to take that step back and we can
Yeah.
just revisit the way we've lived our lives. Not to say it's wrong. In my case, I felt like all the patterns that ultimately contributed to it all served me well up to a certain point that it didn't anymore, right? And I just wasn't
Yeah.
able to adapt that while
Mm.
still trying to be true to my desire to work well and so on and so forth. It's just recognizing, okay, I need to do it differently, still
Mm.
with the same set of goals and ambitions. It's just I
Mm.
have to operate in a different way.
Yeah.
And if burnout is the way to to learn that, then
Yeah.
I accept that, right?
Mm.
But I think, just going back to something you said earlier that reminds me as part of the whole return to work process is, again, go many of the employers we go back to
Mm.
will not have this perspective, understandably. They will, as a
Mm.
in general, right? They're not gonna know what we go through as individuals as we go through our recovery and reconnecting with ourselves. And so some of the things I try to help my clients as well is, how do you advocate for yourself knowing you're not going back the same person? Your workplace might think you're coming back the same person. You look the same, your name's the same, right? Like maybe you have the
Make
same
no
set of
difference.
responsibilities, but you know for yourself that you're not the same person. You've
Mm.
evolved, you've grown. That might mean you're gonna come across differently, or maybe you're gonna hold your
Yeah.
boundaries more clearly, or maybe you don't want to do the same set of responsibilities you used to. So
Mm.
how do you go back feeling empowered to have those conversations, or to readjust kind of your interactions with your
Yeah.
workplace? 'Cause many times individuals think I'm just gonna sit back and wait for my employer to tell me what I need to do to go back, because it's
Mm.
very process oriented.
Mm.
But it's not just the process,
Mm.
right? It's
Mm.
reconnecting with who we are and recovering and creating new rules about how we operate and interact
Mm.
with work. And so that comes with a need to speak up, to renegotiate,
Mm.
and to advocate for yourself. And that can be hard
Mm.
too if they're unsupported and they're guessing their way through how to do that.
Yeah, such an important and thing, that empowering that advocacy, especially when we're still dealing with an under-resourced workforce in terms
Yeah.
of many things, but in terms of around the mental health and I think often because our own relationship with our mental health, it comes out in the workplace, for
Yeah.
leaders and business owners and whatnot. Yeah, but anyway, but that but the whilst we can't control that environment, we can control how we show up for ourselves in
Yeah.
that. So that's where you help and support the people going back to work, is to be
Yeah.
their own advocate in their workplace.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you notice, just like with because I gather you would hear through your clients, is there any particular things that you notice that make I know this, like a good workplace, I just mean like a healthy workplace or a
Yeah.
workplace that supports that transition, like, because I
Yeah.
think sometimes, and I often talk to my clients about this, is noticing the red flags or being able to, because sometimes, and I know the first workplace I went back to, lots of red flags. So I started my
Mm.
exit plan out of there
Yeah.
because I was like, this, I didn't have the energy or want to change. I changed them or speak up. I did speak up on a
Yeah.
couple of occasions, but anyway, but but I suppose this is noticing the green flags, noticing.
Yeah.
I think your gut tells you, but I think it's also nice to, what am I looking out for? Like when I speak
Yeah.
up and when I'm sharing, yeah, what are those
Yeah.
things that, yeah.
I would say, how do you even feel while you're absent is an important indicator.
Mm.
So it's very common for, at least in my experience, for employers or for managers to completely disconnect with their employees while they're
Yeah, I hear
away.
that. Yeah.
Like there's this perception of like, do not get in touch, kind of like
Mm.
leave
Mm.
them alone, which for many reasons is absolutely the right thing to do, because if part of the trauma or the exposure is the workplace, then we want to limit that kind of exposure.
Mm.
However,
Mm,
If an employee has a good relationship with their manager, or if the manager is willing to extend a little bit their discretion,
mm,
a manager with a trusted relationship with their absent employee will probably reach out and say, I'm just here if you need anything, if you have any questions, let me know
mm,
what you want me to communicate to the team, and giving the
mm,
individual that sense of choice to
mm,
decide how that absence is managed and communicated. I think that's rare and unique, but when I hear good examples, it really makes me so happy that
mm,
managers are willing to say, well, I know this is what they say the rule is, but I can exercise my discretion out of care for my
mm,
employee to also use my judgment as to what I want my employee to hear during this difficult time. So that's an example already early in the process
early.
of something you want to look out for. Some other green flags to look out for returning to work is how willing is the environment to hear from the employee, what do you need? Now, you will have cases where they just go back and the manager or their colleagues will say, okay, well, here's the job that's been waiting for you, go get on it. And we
Mm,
expect things to just continue as they were pre-absence.
mm,
That's a red flag.
mm,
Even if you're able to, as the returning employee, work through that, the
mm,
fact that there is no conversation as to what's going to be helpful for you this time, what do you need, what kind of support do you need, how do we get you caught back into, the things you've missed. If none of that exists, I'd feel concerned. Uh,
100%. Mm,
so the opposite of that being the green flag is, even before day one, is the employer or the manager engaging in a conversation with the employee to say, how do you want your return to look like?
mm,
What do you feel comfortable doing and not doing? What types of support or accommodations you might need or adjustments that you might need. Sometimes even well-intentioned managers will not know to ask those questions. And that's why the work with the individual to prepare them to have the conversation and to trigger the conversation is also important. Because
mm,
well-meaning leaders will say, I didn't know I even needed to ask. I thought there was a policy in the background that will just take care of itself. And so for the individual to have the conversation and use the response of their manager as a data point to
mm,
indicate, okay, am I coming back in a place that feels safe, that will
yeah,
support my recovery? Or
mm,
are they met with a response that's indicating, this might not work out, and then they can decide what to do with that.
yeah. Wow. So many things. But so it just really sits. I think the thing that's sitting with me is open communication.
Yeah,
Uh, but that you're working with that individual and empowering them with triggering that conversation, not relying on that it will come from them. And continuing to the other thing, just continuing to check in with themselves. How does this feel? Is this okay for me? And you mentioned earlier, there's a bit of, it's a risk, it's an experiment when you go back and, you know, like, and you can go back and then go, okay, yes, this is not, and I need to pivot. And nothing, is wrong with that. You've gone and
right.
you checked it out. I feel like this is a bit of a sidestep, but I don't want to skip it because a lot of my audience are midlife women, and we have
Yeah,
talked well, yeah, even about women returning from birth of a child, because that can, I mean, when I'm talking about midlife, I include the 35 and beyond. I mean, often it's
yeah,
40 to
yeah,
60, but
yeah,
like wherever because some people can be in perimenopause that early,
right.
sometimes even earlier because of medical procedures
Yeah,
that cause us to go into menopause. Um, but yeah, I suppose with especially midlife tends to be the era where there's a lot more load on the woman.
right.
Yeah, we might still be raising our children. We might also be caring for elderly parents. Often, sometimes, deterioration in our own health, not just mental health, but health physically,
Yeah,
can be showing up, like joint issues, chronic illness, marriages, partnerships, separation,
yeah.
work. Often our load is a lot higher with responsibility. Anyway, what's going on? And then, of
There's a
course,
lot going on. Yes. Yeah,
chuck in the perimenopausal stage,
yeah,
which can not always, certainly
yeah,
create some disruption as well as we go through that very natural transition. Just yeah, I just wonder what you've noticed in your experience with any midlife women
Yeah.
that because I spoke to a lady, she a clinical psych, she calls herself the midlife psychologist. She focuses
Mm,
specifically on that area now and has done for many years. She talks about, she says, like, I think every midlife woman is burnt out to some degree. You know, we
right.
all are carrying chronic stress for lots of reasons. So yeah, I just wonder if there's anything that you've noticed with your midlife
Yeah.
women with that return to work or the time off work, just anything you can share
Yeah.
about your experience there for them
Yeah.
particularly. Mm.
I think it really speaks to what you've described, just the amount of things that they are carrying. Not just the amount, but the weight of what they're carrying in that period of time. You really sense the heaviness of everything that they're having to work through between caring for kids, but caring for their aging parents. Many of those I work with have families abroad as well. So
Oh,
the distance of and the emotional load of not being physically where
mm,
your heart sometimes wants to be.
I can get
And
that.
then your body is changing and you're going through all of these changes that can be really confusing and difficult. And there's just really a lot.
Yeah,
Um, and then there's a crisis of meaning and purpose of like, I've been doing
identity.
all of this all of these years, but like, is
Mm,
this everything I've worked for? And sometimes they're confronted with the question of what's next for me, and where do I want to
mm,
go from here? And if this was my one last chance to make a significant change in my profession, what would that be? And so there's just a lot that they're
mm,
carrying. And I remember coming across a study, but this was already back in 2020, I believe, where it was a study conducted in the Netherlands. It was qualitative, so a lot of interviews with
I
midlife
love that.
women,
Mm,
and they all described the sense of I'm just at the end of my rope, as
I,
the point where they started to experience or recognize that they might be going through burnout. That's just the level of exhaustion.
mm,
And so as we spoke about earlier, so they all would go through, but my clients would go through that point of being absent. But what I'm finding is that they're trying to make a lot of change in themselves,
mm,
rightfully so, but
mm.
there's not a lot of change happening in the system and the structure. And again, it always requires two things to work.
The
Um,
relationship, yeah.
yeah, there again, it's the relationship. And what saddens me is that these individuals will sometimes make choices that put them economically at a disadvantage.
Mm,
So they decide to work less, or they decide to not work professionally and engage in other jobs that might be well below their competence level.
mm.
And they make those choices, which is not living out to their potential, but that's because they feel like that's the only way. And that's
Yeah.
unfortunate because
Mm,
there are economic, societal consequences for midlife women to remove themselves from
100%.
the work that they do. And typically, this is the period of time where, you've probably achieved a certain level in your career. You're ready to lead others. You're ready to take on even more
Mm,
responsibility. But then all of these other experiences happen that pulls them out. And what a loss to our society
100,
and to our organization when women leave the workforce at that age where they can have bigger influence and impact around them, right? And just so
it's,
from that perspective, I
yeah.
feel like, what a shame when they have to decide to do that. Where I see the opportunity is that, at least here in Switzerland, there's been a lot more awareness around menopause in the workplace. So many organizations are starting to pick up on, we have to talk about this more openly. We have to recognize that this is a life experience that our employees are going through, and therefore, what can we do as an organization to not even use the word accommodate, but to just allow for it to happen and still find ways to get the best out of our employees. And that can
Mm,
create really good systemic changes that will
mm,
allow these midlife women to say, I still have a place here,
I belong,
right?
yeah.
But it does take time. So,
Mm,
we have to see in 2 or 3 years or in 5 years down the road
mm,
whether these experiences are actually changing for women.
mm. It's
Um, yeah.
it's like what needs to change is the system. Like
Yeah.
I felt my heart sank. I mean, I've heard it already, and the stats prove it too. In terms of women, yeah, doing all the things that you did. in order to look after themselves because they're burnt out, they're stretched thin. But it's all, and I was listening to a podcast this morning around this topic too. It's like it ends up being the ownership on them to change, them to
Right.
sacrifice. And this, like, they're like, okay, it's our responsibility to do some things, but where is the we? Where is the collective?
Right.
Where is the systemic support?
Yeah.
Because a woman, any person, doesn't matter, like, but the woman in most, a lot of developed countries or just in a lot of countries, regardless, are holding a lot
Yeah.
of the weight,
Yeah.
emotionally, mentally, and therefore physically, because that affects us physically. Um,
Yeah.
that we need the help from the systems. And like you said, it is a financial loss. It does impact the whole wider economy and stuff by having these very capable women to be part of that
Yeah.
senior workforce of helping the next generation and all the
Right.
wisdom they have to share. But they just need a leg up. They need freaking
Yeah.
support because
Right. Yeah.
they're carrying a lot. So I get a little bit angry. It's like, just take some, support this system, please support the
Yeah.
women, like,
Yeah.
so they don't have to make these choices that they're left with at the moment because they have no other choice. Give them choices.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm
Yeah.
off my soap opera
Yeah.
box.
No, I can completely join you with
Oh
that. But
yeah,
I
you.
think,
I know. I'm
yeah,
like in good company here. You're very much
exactly. Like,
there.
I'm
It's
completely
so
with you. And yeah,
it sucks. Like, they shouldn't have to, but I am so glad women are looking after themselves in whatever way and choices that they have.
right.
But like, if they had the right support, or they had the system supporting them, including the workplace, including partners at home,
Right.
including whatever it might be, financial, I don't
Right.
know, but
Yeah.
it's
And I
it's
want to
yeah.
call out in this particular case. Like sometimes you hear people say, yeah, and then you label it as, okay, menopause, you label it as something else. And then like there's this whole conversation around it for a period of time, and then it just dies off because there's a new trend or a new, preferred topic of
Mm.
conversation. And what I really would want to aspire to, and I know I can't change the world, but I would love for organizations to get to a place where it doesn't anymore matter what the circumstance is
Mm.
without having to label it, and just having employees understand that the organization is willing and accepting of life phases and fluctuating mental health, and here are things you can do to support yourself, and here are things we commit to doing as an organization. And so
100%.
that we don't, I feel like sometimes we put a topic on a pedestal, and then it also creates certain risks that we're excluding other
Mm.
experiences. Or some
Mm.
women feel very uncomfortable about the amount of attention being put on menopause because they're going through their own process of being ready and willing to talk about it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
Mm.
I
Yeah,
I
which
think
is
we
so
just have
bad.
to be careful, as with many people and culture topics, that we put
Yeah.
so much attention on one rather than how do we just broaden and scale this to say we have different generations in our organization, which has implications to life experience. And, the world is
Mm.
also getting difficult sometimes, that has
Mm.
implications on health. And how do we just support that?
Yeah, it's almost like, the way I'm kind of seeing what you're saying too is just like, there can be one, I'm probably simplifying, but one simple process that, or framework or process in which underlies everything, like, if you're employing humans, if you're working with
Yeah.
humans and not AI, like, I mean, I'm all for AI, by
Right.
the way, but like,
Yeah.
you're working with fellow humans. We have to lead with a human process, and that would,
Yeah.
inclusion of all. Like, I think of people living with, chronic illnesses, people that
Right.
could be creating disability, or definitely,
Yeah.
often there is levels of disability. Like, I know a lot of people who, are chronically ill and disabled, who have and could have some capacity to
Yeah.
work with the right resources, but there's not necessarily the place for them because,
Yeah.
anyway, I think, yeah,
Yeah.
these open processes, and but also, I feel like in that framework, in that process, there's that open communication, there's flexibility and choice too, because not
Right.
everyone's going to be ready and okay to talk about their stuff, and that should be
Right.
okay. Um,
Yeah.
we're not talking about work processes, we're talking about
Yeah.
their human processes, but there should be an avenue of open communication around that to create flexibility and choice to be able
Yeah.
to participate in that workplace in a way that's possible for
Yeah.
them and for the workplace, for the business. I mean, I
Yeah.
understand it has to work for the business too,
Yeah.
you know, like
Of course. Yeah, 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 of
I
course. And
think
we don't,
yeah,
yeah, they
there's
can't
certain
do this all for
workplaces, yeah.
free and there's still profit and revenue goals and totally get
Well,
that. But I do hope that there is a way we get to that place where we just recognize, yeah, we have to be able to create a workplace environment that can retain individuals across different life
that's
phases and
yeah.
life circumstances that they might be dealing with.
100%. Yeah. I think, yeah, we've got a long ways to go with that. But I think that's a really lovely way to capture that and not exclude all those, you know, whether it's, you know, women going through this phase, yeah, mental health, burnout, whatever,
Yeah,
physical health going, you know, all of that.
yeah,
But these issues, these ones that, you know, haven't had as much airplay, but yeah, let's not override other ones that haven't had a lot of airplay either.
right.
So yeah. Anyway, I
Yeah.
feel like I mean we could keep going on. I feel like that we could have a discussion till I often say till the cows come home. Have you heard
Yeah,
that?
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, we've heard that phrase. And yes, I think the topics like this you can go on for hours and hours
Yeah.
because we, obviously we both care about this a lot.
Yeah.
So,
But what I often say too, and no pressure, I just like to share with the audience, like if there's anything that you're still sitting with that, like I would really have liked Shannon to ask Karina that question, or,
yeah,
you know, if there's a question, please, whatever platform you're on, you know, comment. I always leave my email, so email me. And I could always have Karina back on if she'd like to answer to those questions. We could have a special episode if she likes to answer those
for
questions.
sure.
So I
Yeah,
do invite the audience to do that, but bring the questions to me and then we'll do it. Yeah, we will look at maybe doing an episode where we answer them. But yeah, because I know we can't, you know, we'd be here for a few hours.
for sure.
Yeah,
And
really
we
exhausted.
could be here for a few hours, and we also, our listeners also have a life probably outside of
Exactly. That's what
this
I'm
episode, so we let them go.
yeah, I'm like, how
But I'm
long? Yeah.
definitely happy to answer questions if any come up, because there's a lot here to really talk about.
Yeah. But I think
Yeah,
that it could be like another episode where we'll go into. But what
probably.
I always like to ask as well the guests, if there's anything that, you know, a listener out there, someone maybe watching on YouTube who is in this space, maybe they're a midlife woman, maybe they're just, you know, a woman
Mm,
or men in or person in whatever era, but they're in this space of returning to work, or maybe even thinking of taking time, but let's just like return to work. Is there anything that you'd like to leave them with? Like, you know, one
mm.
message that you're hoping they would take away with them? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would maybe first, maybe there's maybe two or three things in
I'll go for
here.
it. You don't have to say them.
If it's just one. So I'll take that liberty. But first, I want to just acknowledge and validate the experience that they're going through. Because some might feel like, oh, I'm making too much of a big deal out of this, or I'm catastrophizing this. You're not. So if that's your experience, and if you're going through a tough time, that's what it is. And I want to just be able to affirm that it is difficult. It's a vulnerable transition to be going through. I want to encourage them to surround themselves with people or resources that will help, because it can be very isolating to be on mental health leave. You're suddenly cut off from, the your day-to-day life essentially, and so surround yourself with people who care about you. um, Recognize your influence on the process.
Mm,
There's a lot that you can do to minimize, I won't say eliminate, but to minimize the fear and the doubts and the struggles about going back to work.
mm,
And I want to give you that sense of agency and empowerment that you can design that for yourself in a way that works for you.
mm,
And that hopefully that you get to a place where you can get to advocate for what you need and to speak up for what you need. And if it's not your current employer, there will be someone else or something else out there that's ready to receive you back from your mental health leave. So take your time. If you're listening to this, take your time. No one's rushing you, and you deserve that care.
mm. Oh, Karina, that's beautiful, beautiful. I had I always get like these buzzes when just words
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Those are such important words. And I'm glad that you took liberty and didn't stay with that one. No one should limit us. Like, just go. No, I'm really glad that you
Thank you. I
did.
appreciate it.
And I absolutely appreciate, every guest who comes on here, they do so out of the kindness of their hearts, and their want and desire to make change and be part of that shift. And you're another one of those beautiful souls who've done this. And I just want to thank you on behalf of anyone listening out there, and watching, for your wisdom and for your compassion and kindness in sharing today.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I think we care a lot about this, and we just want, more people to feel like, yeah, they have a place in the work environment, as part of their life after burnout. So
100%. Well, thank you, Karina.
thank you so much, Shannon, for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining me on Midlife Reclaimed. I am Shannon A. Swales, and I hope the conversation today sparks some ideas, helps support you along your way in reclaiming your midlife. Now, if you'd like to stay connected, and we encourage you to do so, please subscribe, hit that subscribe button, and stay in contact with Midlife Reclaimed episodes. You can also follow us on social media under Shannon A. Swales. And also, if you want to dive deeper into this and be part of a community, check out our Midlife Reclaimed membership. The link is in the show notes. Now, before you go, please remember that if you're feeling overwhelmed, distressed, seek professional support. This podcast, whilst delivers valuable content, it is general in nature, is not a replacement for therapist-client relationships. So we, from the bottom of our heart, encourage you to seek that support. We're not meant to do this alone. Let's reclaim our midlife together, one courageous, bold step at a time. Take care of you. Bye for now.